This is the first edition, belated, but it is the first edition of the Khoodeelaar campaign coming from London with the world exclusive look at the role played by Fleet Street, that is the London-centric main print newspapers, and imitated and copied by the BBC, Sky News, ITV, and Channel 4 News and Channel 4, the outlet. What the contents and the role played by the Fleet Street papers, to those who may be watching this for the first time and coming across the word or phrase Fleet Street for the first time, Fleet Street is the name of the street that is that faces the St. Paul's Cathedral in London and stretches up to the Strand, where the main building of the courts, High Court, are situated, not far from the building called India House, which is still the headquarters of the Indian diplomatic mission in the UK. And it goes past the Strand into Charing Cross and not far from the Downing Street and the Palace of Westminster. So that's Fleet Street. And Fleet Street for almost 200 years was known, associated with the main print newspapers, because their headquarters or head offices were actually in Fleet Street, or in the case of the Daily Mail and the Murdoch-owned Sun now, the side roads from Fleet Street. So Fleet Street, for example, the Observer, which has been published according to the entry on the Wikipedia for 229 years now, the weekly Sunday newspaper called the Observer. And it's as long as the Times newspaper, now owned by Rupert Murdoch. And because of the empire, the newspapers, the English, and their English newspapers, Fleet Street newspapers, dominated the market, the commercial market in the colonized countries in Africa and Asia. And they also dominated the cultural message that was being repeated by the English language counterparts based in Asia and Africa. Most importantly, in terms of numbers of people affected, they represented the message across the subcontinent of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And even today, now, the 7th of December, 2020, although it's the last hour of the 7th of December, 2020. A look at the dominant, quote, elite associations and connections and activities in today's India shows the special priority and dominance given to the English language outlets or English phrases, and I mean the most topical, the most telling and most easily accessible evidence of that is the so-called Mumbai or Bollywood films. The ones that are kind of highly promoted through the internet, YouTube and others, the ones that are called hits, the Bollywood hits, let's say of the last 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. We could go back decades, but in the last 10 years, let's say, the blockbusters that have been produced and are being pumped on the internet have a very significant narrative, the theme, which is linked to and dependent on and derived from the culture created and established by the British Empire. Some of the dialogues, some of the kind of expressions used in the scripts in any of the languages, the original kind of films, shot and filmed in Telugu, Tamil, Bangla, Hindi, and other languages, have a common theme between them, among them. An expression such as "I love you" is a romantic kind of bits of the blockbusters, is very much there without any translation. It is there in its original. And most of the architecture that is featured in these films are not Indian architecture. They are not based in India. Many of them must be filmed outside of India, in other countries, mainly European countries. Which countries? We cannot give a list because the list is not expressly stated, but it is clear that although they are recorded and shot in India about Indian kind of so-called stories, they are not physically showing India and the population, the caste, and the caste meaning the participants, not caste in the caste system, which too is there, but in this instance, in this discussion, the cast includes the artists, the players, the actors. And all the dialogue, the kind of theme, the storyline, these are all very much traceable to a subservient kind of mindset. And it's very confused, and it's very inconclusive, and it's very kind of untruthful, in that the stories are not telling the story of the society in India today. They are kind of inventing a new kind of story which is worse than real life stories, because they are leaving out all concepts of democracy, the abuse of democracy and the abuse of anti-democratic kind of tendencies. They are kind of promoting those by keeping them unexplored and unexplained. And the storylines are very simplistic and very, very anti-educational and anti-society, and anti the concept of rule of law and due process and international order, and the need for peace and the need to protect the environment and protect human rights. One recurring kind of incident or list of things that kind of happens in these blockbusters is the victimization of the woman. Many of the women are murdered. Many of the children are abducted. Many of the mothers of the so-called villain or the hero are abducted and treated abysmally, and then also murdered and shot. And there is no kind of correlation between these and the reality. And the message is not one of defending the woman and respecting the woman or respecting the child or the girl. it is one of doing the opposite. So what sells? I mean, these are not selling points. What actually sells is the pretty face. And most of the kind of actresses or actors, female leads, turn out to be as white as European women, if not whiter than the European women. Whether they are in real life of that complexion is not the point. The point is how they are portrayed in these blockbuster films. And the question is, what on earth is Bollywood doing to the Indian society? It is, without any doubt, the single most attack on the society and societies in India. Single most. So, what the Fleet Street Papers today, 2020, December 27th, 2020, kind of contain, it's not a representation. What the papers contain is still uncritically and stupidly imitated by the various English language titles published in India. Well, the same applies to Bangladesh, and the almost identical thing happens in Pakistan. Because these three countries were three of the components of what was the subcontinent until 1947. And the fact that 73 years later, these three countries are publishing rubbish, imitating slavishly the English versions, shows that the empire, the imperialism, was not resisted by the so-called elites and the big business kind of contractors and whatever. I mean, the second independence war, 1857, was kind of suppressed, not numerically by the English or the British imperialists, but by the brainwashing of the majority of the colluders in the population, who have been in power since then, since 47. And those who devise and create and script these blockbusters are the worst examples in cultural terms, in imitation terms, of treachery and betrayal of the basic principles of loving the community, loving the society, loving the country, loving the language, wherever because in India there are hundreds of languages. So all the languages are being kind of treated with contempt by the makers and the editors and the creators and promoters and the marketeers of the so-called Bollywood blockbusters. So, given that dismal situation in post-quote independence India, it would appear that they are kind of alert as to the meaning of independence, at least, and they're apologetic, but they're not. So back to Fleet Street and back to London, the original newspapers are completely as dishonest as they could be. And they're as dysfunctional as they can ever be, ever could be. And they're not informing the readers, so-called, of the truth, anything like the truth of what is happening in Britain, with the British state, with the British parliament, with the British big business, and with the British policies and British culture and British institutions. And they're, of course, not examining the evidence of what causes people to be ill, what causes people to be deprived of the health service at the point of need. What are the causes? They're not examining those either. So it's like a smoke screen, permanent smoke screen that Fleet Street constitutes against the people, to the people, against getting access to what is happening and what the editors and so-called journalists actually know is happening, but choose not to publish, not to share with the people. For example, the utterances, the behavior, and the kind of statements and the decisions made by Donald Trump in the last 4 years, one fraction of that kind of bad behavior by anyone in Africa or Asia would be featured on the front page of the Fleet Street papers, the tabloid, the Sun, the Daily Mail, the Express, and so on. And yet Trump's racism, stupidity, illegality, criminal behavior on a daily basis have been treated as being immune from any attention, let alone from criticism. So what are we looking at in the newspapers? When you say we diagnose Fleet Street, we are not looking for the truth. We are looking for the latest evidence of the lies and the lying by the papers. And all the headlines, let's say on the last kind of, say from March onwards, March 2022, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So that's 10 months. 10 months since the first kind of incidents of the COVID virus appearing on the UK was recognized in public. The newspapers have been published every day, most of them. The only two that don't publish every single day, of course, is the Financial Times, which doesn't appear on Sundays, and the Morning Star, which is not part of Fleet Street, but it is a daily incident, and it too, like the Financial Times, doesn't appear on Sundays. The others, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Daily Star, the Daily Express, the Daily Borisgraph, the Daily Mirror, they've got Sunday kind of appearances. And both the Sunday appearances and the weekday appearances are kind of marked by the persistence in lying and hiding the truth. So what is the purpose? What is the purpose of the newspapers? Because they're not breaking any stories really, and they're not telling the truth about anything serious. What is the role of these papers? And I would suggest on the evidence that the role is to keep the gullibles gullible, in states of gullibility and stupidity. So all around, the politicians, the papers, and the people are circling, kind of whirling in an endless state of stupidity and ignorance. By default, this society operates by default. Because if the people in posts of so-called power and government, if their behavior was actually examined objectively, then this society should not be functioning. It is not functioning for most people who are in kind of deprivation and denial of service and human rights, but it is functioning for the others. Where it is not functioning is to be found in areas like the Tower Hamlets, East London Borough, Newham, East London Borough, and other London boroughs with high deprivation indexes or indices. And it would appear that as almost all the deprived boroughs are kind of under the so-called control, the political control of the Labour Party linked elected councillors. The Labour Party would be held to account, but it isn't. And in the case of the four boroughs, one is Hackney, one is the Newham, the other is Tower Hamlets, and the other is Lewisham. These are what is called councils that are kind of controlled by elected mayor. And the elected mayor is not accountable. The elected mayor is not held to account. And the elected mayor can do anything, and it is the elected mayor that is doing anything they want. And the elected councillors, who are the majority of the council, each of the councils. In the case of Newham, of course, the elected councillors are the only councillor, the elected Labour councillors are the only councillors. No other party has got any elected councillor on the Newham council. So what is happening with the lack of any alternative, that is to say opposition parties, makes it impossible to even think of accountability, of democracy, of ethics or morality in places like the Newham Council. And Newham is one of the boroughs that has, in the last 10 months, has had very high rates of infections of the virus. Now, Newham can say, partly accurately, that it's not the fault of Newham Council itself that the rate of infection has been so high in the borough. But if the effect of the virus is treated as an illness that takes away the functionality of a person that is ill with whatever the illness is, whatever debilitating illness they suffer from or are affected by. If the virus is treated as an illness that debilitates and incapacitates the victim of the illness, then it can be compared with other events, other activities, the policies by Newham Council on housing and other needs of the person or persons affected by the decision. And the record of Newham Council, as is the record of Tower Hamlets Council, of Hackney Council, of Lewisham Council, the four London councils with elected mayors in post, then the effects on the people of the wrong decision by the Newham Council are identical and as bad as the effects of the virus. And yet in the Labour Party, centrally or in regional terms in London, there is no even a room for holding the elected councillors to account, let alone to hold the elected mayor to account. Now, this has been seen in the last few days in Liverpool, that the Labour Party doesn't have any control. Labour Party has no democratic accountability control on its Labour Party card-carrying, membership-carrying elected mayor in Liverpool or in any other parts. The only thing that the Labour Party has done has been a completely misrepresented word called suspension. They've been saying that Joe Anderson, the elected mayor of Liverpool City Council, has been suspended due to the investigation which is ongoing, this police investigation. And it has been toned down, the suspension, the word suspension, and its publicity kind of impact has been undermined by adding the word administratively suspended. That is to say, neither the Labour Party nor Joe Anderson is admitting that he has been suspended for misconduct, or he has been suspended due to his flouting any rule by the Labour Party against corruption in elected post or positions. For example, the election, Joe Anderson was elected mayor at the expense of Liverpool. The first time he was elected was 2012. And long before any arrest or any kind of publicly known investigation into alleged bribery and witness intimidation, etc. Over the years, from 2012 up till last month, let's say, in Liverpool, there has been a significant kind of section of the electorate and the local population that has subscribed to the call that Joe Anderson should not be in that post, regardless of any prosecution, regardless of any kind of arrest or not, because the people didn't know that Anderson would be arrested. There was no evidence that he would be arrested or he would be charged. So people were relying on other misuses, other misconduct, other wrongdoings by Joe Anderson ever since he became incumbent in the post of elected mayor in 2012. So we say that the fact that he was under so many calls for resignation, and the Labour Party didn't actually take any action against him. The Labour Party didn't say, we shall investigate all these allegations. The Labour Party even now is not saying that they will be investigating the evidence against Joe Anderson, evidence as based on the information that publicly people have uttered over the last 8 years. So the Labour Party in the UK may say, and its kind of propagandists may say, that it's a socialist and a democratic party. On the evidence in Liverpool, on the evidence in Scotland, on the evidence in, say, for example, in Sheffield, about the massacre of the trees by the Sheffield Council, and the failure of the Labour Party to do anything to protect the trees, and on the evidence of the areas Blackburn and Barnsley and other places where the organized gangs of Pakistani origin rapists targeted white girls, mainly white girls, for grooming, for sex, and they abused them, they raped them, they prostituted them, they pimped them. And the Labour Party is not on the record as doing anything in any of the places. Extrapolate that and apply that to London and the corruption that is rampantly ongoing in Tower Hamlets, in Newham, in Lewisham, in Hackney, concerning all kinds of aspects of individuals and groups' lives and welfare. And you can see that the Labour Party in the UK today is not a party that is upholding the basic democratic accountability standard or ethics or morality, and that it is in place by default because there is no other alternative party, alternative to the conservatives, that is organized enough to get or pocket or kind of bag seats at local council election or regional council elections or at parliamentary elections. Now, this may be said that it is connected with the fact that the Labour Party has been in existence for more than 100 years and that it has been able to establish a kind of strategic vote gathering kind of spots in various constituencies and various boroughs. That is true. And that there is no alternative party or group that is doing the same thing to replace the Labour Party as the elected, mainly elected posts, owners or holders at the local council elections in those areas. Now, all of this is fact. All of this, I'm saying fact. And all of these affect millions of people in Britain. And yet none of this is reported by the Fleet Street papers. There is no comments about the corruption that goes on every day, affecting hundreds of thousands of people in every kind of area. Corruption by the council, corruption through the local council, corruption in the local council. That is to say, elected councillors and permanent post holders in the given council. Today we have been talking again about Croydon Council. Now, Croydon in South London is controlled by the Labour Party, the Croydon Council. And the controlling councillors have been exposed openly as engaged in crimes. Although the word crime and concept of crime have not been expressly used in the coverage, but all the evidence published by private eye magazine's page called Rotten Boroughs, all the evidence contained in the coverage point to only one conclusion, that is to say that Croydon's leading councillors or Croydon's elected councillors holding the leading positions in that council have been behaving as a gang of criminals, stealing from the councils, that is the public's kind of funds, and landing Croydon's electorate in debts of more than £1 billion. And yet, the Labour Party has not spoken a word. Keir Starmer has not spoken a word. And there has been no statement about either Croydon or about Tower Hamlets or about Newham or any other corrupt mayored kind of council, all linked to the Labour Party because their elected mayor post holders are still members of the Labour Party. And there have been evidence. Every kind of area has had evidence about the corrupt behavior of the council under the directly elected mayor, but the Labour Party nationally, centrally has refused to go on the record and condemn or comment on any of this goings on. So when the Fleet Street actually cover in hyper propaganda kind of terms the troubles of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn over the allegations against his leadership that it was anti-Semitic, that is to say anti-Jewish people. I mean, that kind of height of prominence given to the alleged anti-Semitism of the Jeremy Corbyn-fronted regime of the Labour Party is completely absent on the corruption, on the illegality, and of course, on the racism that every single country, every single council under elected mayor kind of control or facade has been allowing. And it includes the absence of remedies on all aspects of legal rights and legal needs. There is there is a subterranean, if you like, or secondary connection among various time-serving Labour Party MPs and elected post holders. For example, David Lammy, during the last 4 years since the Brexit vote, Lammy has kind of cultivated a persona for himself on the online by jumping on the bandwagon on various kind of cheap, headline-grabbing, topical issues. And Lammy has been a very persistent exploiter of the concepts of the Windrush generations and the Black Lives Matter. And Lammy has been also publishing various accounts of racists trolling him and calling him all kinds of nasty things. So all in all, David Lammy, as the Labour MP for the seat that Barney Grant held previously, David Lammy has been able to promote his image as a black person, African origin black person, in the kind of mainstream media's frame of reporting. David Lammy has also had positions as minister in the Gordon Brown fronted regime, and he is now certainly going to be a minister in the Keir Starmer fronted regime as and when it happens. But Lammy is not doing anything whatsoever to challenge the fundamental racism, the fundamental corruption and criminality practiced by the absolute majority of the Labour Party post holders, elected post holders, either in Parliament or in local councils or in regional kind of counterpart positions, such as in London. And Lammy, although he has got a profile that comes across as Lammy being a kind of willing to work with other people and to credit other people, a close examination of the evidence of his tendency in that regard or propensity in that regard reveals that Lammy has been as crafty a stooge as the next available one or possible one. That he is not really challenging racism, its foundation. That he is not challenging the corruption in the Labour Party, of the Labour Party, by the Labour Party. And Lammy, most certainly, despite the headlines suggesting the contrary, Lammy has not been anywhere near vocal or anywhere nearly as vocal about the corruption, the criminality, the racist prejudice, the hostility, the anti-Muslim agenda operated by the entirety of the legal courts, county courts, magistrates courts, crown courts, the High Court, the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court. Lamy has not been dealing with any of that. So when we talked about Kenan Malik on the Sunday's Observer, and this Sunday's Observer piece with his byline is, "Our leaders cannot preach respect and treat the vulnerable with contempt." Lamy and Malik are similar, two sides of the, let's say, same stooge kind of coin. Because by all evidence and indices, it would be found that Kenan Malik is less critical of the Labour Party than he is of the Conservative Party. Same way, Kenan Malik and David Lamy would be found to have criticizing or been critical of the Conservatives as compared to their stances in relation to the leadership and the identity of the Labour Party in the UK. And this comparison between Malik and Lamy can be taken, extrapolated to include other self-seeking, very black-skinned, or mixed race African kind of origin or African descended operatives in semi kind of official posts or elected posts in the name of or via the Labour Party in the UK. The same happens with a similar kind of backgrounds, people from either African origin or Pakistani, Indian or Bangladeshi origin, and connected with the Labour Party, connected with the so-called left of center. These people are not delivering the accountability, the truthfulness, and the moral rigor that society needs, and the victims of the injustice, the racism, the corruption badly need and are crying out for. And none of these issues that I am kind of examining and discussing is examined at all in the Fleet Street papers. And although I mentioned Kenan Malik from the Observer of yesterday, Sunday, the 6th of December 2020, it is 6th of December that I'm talking about. Today is the 7th of December, but the Observer was dated the 6th of December 2020. So not only are the main institutions of this country corrupt, unaccountable, not only are all the political parties corrupt and unaccountable, not only are the courts of law, they're not justices. There is no such thing as Ministry of Justice. It is Ministry of abusing the term justice. So the legal bureaucracies are not accountable, are not interested in delivering and serving accountability to the vast majority of the ordinary people in whose name they trade. This last week's arrest of Joe Anderson in Liverpool along with Derek Hatton, has not been followed up by the Fleet Street papers today or in the days following the arrests. They've mentioned the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Sunday Times have mentioned the arrest of Joe Anderson, and later the arrest with Joe Anderson of Derek Hatton, whom the actual police initial release didn't name, but others have actually identified him, and they have named him, and he has been named in the Daily Mail online and in the Sun online, and also in the Sun in the print yesterday. That has been true that they've done that, but they have not done the discussion. They have not done the reporting, the investigation, the analysis, either of the kind of built-in corruption and criminality of the post of elected mayor in Liverpool or elsewhere, and in London. I mean, the only other place where they could go to for evidence, I mean, there are 12 or 14 English boroughs with elected mayor imposed on them. So the single place, the main city is London, where there are the largest number of concentration. I mean, Hackney and Tower Hamlets and Newham are next door to each other. So it's a cluster of 3 London local councils, all members of the Labour Party, or the councillors and the elected mayor post holders are members of the Labour Party. So there is a cluster of 3 mayored councils, London councils, and one in Lewisham across the River Thames to the south. And there is no mention in the coverage of the kind of any information about the mayor. There is no mention or let alone any update on the behavior of the existing mayors in Tower Hamlets, in Newham, in Hackney. Nor is there any examination at all of the post of London mayor, where the third person in that post is now incumbent, Sadiq Khan. The other 2, each one incumbent for 8 years, have been Boris Johnson from 2008 to 2016, and Ken Lying-Still Livingstone from 2000 to 2008. Quite apart from Fleet Street's filthy obsession about only one issue with which to damn Ken Lying-Still Livingstone, that is to do with his Livingstone's widely alleged anti-Semitism. Apart from that, Fleet Street has not been talking about Livingstone's corruption, anti-democratic behavior, and his pro-racist criminality and patronage and other abuses of his tenure of 8 years as the incumbent in the post of mayor at the expense of London. Because he abused the position, our movement decided to call him undone mayor. That is a 2-barreled, kind of 2 aspects to that, or 2-dimensional kind of phrase that we created, undone mayor. One is to literally say that he was undone, his myths had been exposed, and the other is the relationship with his nasal sound. And Ken Lying-Still Livingstone has got a nasal kind of phonetics. His diction is not very clear. He pronounces London as London with a nose kind of prominence. So we call him undone mayor for those two reasons. And the other thing, of course, is literally he was absolutely done for by his persistent stupidity, incompetence, and callousness. For example, when his indulgence of one of his so-called advisors was rigorously brought into question due to revelations about that advisor's misconduct and criminality and uncouth behavior. Ken Livingstone decided to condemn the people who were asking him questions about that. Instead of apologizing for his behavior, instead of explaining the evidence and apologizing and resigning. So these are the examples of abuse that can happen when a person is the elected mayor. And that can happen because there is no mechanism democratically in place that subjects this kind of mayor to rigorous and real accountability to the electorates. That's why we have been saying that scrap the corrupting post of elected mayor. We have been saying scrap the corrupt post of elected mayor. We have been saying that scrap the possibility of a crook getting into the position as the elected mayor and then doing the crooked things that they are prone to do and will be unable to be prevented from doing because there is no democratic, legal, constitutional check put in place permanently against their behavior. So we've been saying that and we have been vindicated. As you keep saying, we have been vindicated about the predictions, observations, and warnings we gave about Tower Hamlets. And this is all public. And yet Fleet Street doesn't. Even now, 5 years and 8 months since Richard Morey ousted Lutfur Rahman from the post of elected mayor at the expense of Tower Hamlets, because, as Morey claimed, Lutfur Rahman had been found guilty of corrupt practices. And along with Lutfur Rahman, the elected mayor, who was found to have got in as the elected mayor at the election held on the 22nd of May 2014, Richard Morey also condemned a councillor who was very loyal to Lutfur Rahman and who was treated by Lutfur Rahman as his main lieutenant on the Tower Hamlets Council. So Richard Morey ordered that Lutfur Rahman's election of 22nd of May 2014 was therefore thereby voided, that is to be declared null and void, that it never happened. And Richard Mori also declared that Luthuraman's main lieutenant on the council, Alibor Chaudhry, was no longer to be a councillor. So, 5 years and 8 months later, the Fleet Street newspapers are silent about what Mori was describing as corrupt practices and why Tower Hamlets people, the electors, the ordinary people, the many victims of the corruption and criminality of Tower Hamlets Council's elected mayor in post deserved remedies, deserved justice, objectively defined. And the papers, Fleet Street papers have been silent about that. The only time that the Fleet Street papers had any interest in what corrupt practices went on at the expense of London, while Ken Livingstone Livingston was in post as the incumbent mayor at the expense of London, was when the series of allegations against Lee Jasper. Lee Jasper was the highest profiled, highly abusive advisor to Ken Livingstone who was reported on several days by the London Evening Standard. Instead of facing up to his failures over Lee Jasper, as reported by the Evening Standard and repeated by others, and instead of apologizing for that behavior to the ordinary electors of London, Ken Livingstone took a very different stand. He appeared before the London Assembly and issued a series of condemnation against the members of the Assembly for daring to question him, Ken Livingstone. That is the extent, that is the kind of behavior of an anti-democratic, dictatorial occupant in the post of elected mayor. And that can be found, examples of that can be found everywhere. They can be found in the behavior of Luthuraman. They can be found in the behavior of Robin Wales in Newham, Luthuraman in Tower Hamlets, Robin Wales in Newham, and they can be found in Lewisham in the behavior of Steve Bullock. And what has happened, despite all the evidence being known publicly, Fleet Street has not to this day examined or published a single examination, really, as to the anti-democratic kind of legislation, which is the option to have an elected mayor in any borough or in London. Fleet Street hasn't done that. Academically, in terms of the kind of college or universities, the only so-called academic work done about London's misdescribed as governance was by a man who is, I think he's now dead, who had an Indian woman sub-academic as a stooge, providing the disparity display. And that book was a complete disgrace. It's an apologia for Ken lying still Livingstone. Now, that person, who is now dead, I think, could never have spent even one single week compared to my 6 years of actively engaging in monitoring the lies and corruption of Ken lying still Livingstone during 1981 to 1986. And I saw evidence on those years that Ken Livingstone was lying, that Ken Livingstone was a petty, selfish, corrupt, racist individual who was desperate to use any opportunity to promote his image and to pounce on any critic who came anywhere near exposing him, as he did in years later in the encounter he had with Oliver Feingold of the Evening Standard. Feingold is no longer attached to the Evening Standard, but in the year 2005, when he dared ask Ken Livingstone a question as to what Livingstone had been up to, Oliver Feingold was pounced on and his Jewish identity denounced, abused, and outrageously offended by Ken lying still Livingstone. And that is the kind of behavior that a racist dictator can kind of decide to indulge in when he or they assume that they are not being held to account or they are not being held accountable to the people in the electorate or the people in the assembly, so-called. And all of this known to the Fleet Street media, and they have not reported. They have not reported, they have not even mentioned this incident, except peripherally, except tokenistically, except only on forgettable occasions. And yet this is the central plank of the evidence of the unfitness for purpose for that post and for that post holder, either at London level or at London boroughs levels. And we shall be articulating and listing other factual evidence of the corruption and criminality of the elected mayor post.